All right. Well, I'll tell you what, we're running 7 minutes late, so we will go ahead and, well, we'll have a song, I guess we can sing a song. You have a song, Carson?
I do.
All right.
If you would turn your songbooks to number 29. We'll sing the first and last verse of number 29, and then we'll be dismissed to our classes. Let us sing. Beautiful robe so white, beautiful land of light, beautiful home so bright, where there shall come no night, beautiful crown of wear, shining and bright o'er there, yonder in mansions fair, gather us there. Beautiful robes of white, beautiful land of light, beautiful home so bright, beautiful land of light, beautiful crown, shining so fair, beautiful mansions bright, gather us there. Beautiful things on high, over in yonder sky, thus I shall leave this shore, counting my treasures, Lord, where we shall never die, carrying by and by, never to sorrow more, heavenly store. Beautiful robes of white, beautiful land of light, beautiful home so bright, beautiful land of light, beautiful crown, shining so fair, beautiful mansions bright, gather us there. Let's go to our classes.
Good morning. Good to have everybody with us this morning. We're in our class of the Book of Psalms. We'll be continuing through our study there. You may hear my voice a little different for just a minute. I got a cough drop in my mouth, and it'll be gone in a moment. Then I'll sound better. So, but we are going to be looking here, continuing in book number 3. Book number 3, as we continue in book 3, talking about chapter 73 through chapter 89. And as we've been looking at it, it deals a lot with, of course, as we said, with the exile of Babylon. So we're going to continue with that. We'll finish it up this morning, and then we'll jump into our first chapter, that is chapter 73, to look at what's going on in this book and what it's about. We know as Christians, I am sure, as I stated last week and the week before that, I think, that we would all like to stay somewhere where it is comfortable, secure, no problems for us at all. I mean, that's a normal thing. That's something that anybody would want in this world, and be able to live a life like that as we look to it. And we know this is even how Israel would have wanted it, what they would have expected, but of course they weren't living the way they were supposed to. So we know that did not happen. That was not going to happen for them in the way they were. So book 3 of the Psalms, we understand when we look at book 3, we realize that, I'm just going to get my clicker to work here. All right, there we go. Book 3 of Psalms acknowledges the devastation of sin and of God's people. As we know, they were taken away into exile. We know I showed this picture last week, this drawing. This is the temple of the Lord as it is burning in ruins, and the descendants of David are no longer on the throne of Zion. So they are done. They'll no longer, none of David's family, it's completely done. Israel is done, basically, in a sense, you might as well say, because everything has changed now, with the temple being destroyed, them being let out of this country, actually taken out of this country, and moved into exile there into Babylon. We know that God's people are completely disoriented, is what's happening to them, and Book 3 takes us through the stages in their lives, and basically allowing us to apply them to our lives also. Basically, if you have, say, nothing, feel like you have nothing left, or prepare us actually for restoration. And that's what this book's all about, is trying to let these people know that they thought they had nothing, but they do. And God wants to prepare them for the restoration that they're going to have and be a part of. To put in other words, of course, many professional Christians believe they can avoid the devastation of Book 3 and simply enjoy God's blessings. But we know that would be great, that would be wonderful. And I tell you what that would be called. That would be called the Garden of Eden before evil and before sin entered in, or it's what we would call heaven. Because, brethren, we're not going to have that on earth. It's just not going to have as much as we want to. But I'm going to say this. We can do our best to enjoy the blessings that we do have from God, and we need to enjoy them. And when things happen, when things have problems like this, and we see, and especially maybe it's our fault that things are happening sometimes, you know, we need to correct that with God, like here with Israel. Sometimes we have no control of it at all. It's not our control whatsoever. And I think about this in Israel. I think about the children. Those children, those younger ones, that they had nothing to do with this. It wasn't their fault. It was their parents, and it was the ones older than them, grandparents and so on, that made the dumb decisions to not follow God in the way that they should. And so now they're gonna feel the devastation of it. And this is what's happening here. And so the hardships, the setbacks, and it shows us that they needed to go deeper into God, with God, just like you and I need to go deeper with God and everything we're about. So we need to press on, just like they we need to press on in our faith. And when everything around us, we know, can crumble from time to time, and with this we are taught in how important it is that we need to trust in God's grace. We need to trust in the grace of God that He speaks of and that He talks about in His Scriptures. So as we look at that, this type of living with God can only be reached, rather, by going through troubles, persecution, and sufferings. The only way, you know, if all we had, I want to just ask this, if all we had was God's blessings, and we were never challenged, we were never had trials or anything, do you think we would take advantage of those blessings and just like, think like, oh well, there they are from time to time, and just go on about life? I mean, think about when things are going really, really good, and people kind of forget sometimes about who. They forget about God. They kind of put them on the back burner. Bill?
It seems like mostly God's blessings are noticed in their absence instead of their presence.
Right.
That when we lose them, good health, something, well, that sure was good, or whatever we got. So it seems like sometimes God's blessings are more noticed in absence.
Right. Yeah, and that's a very good point. You're right. And once it's gone, it's like, where'd that go? I mean, yeah, and it's like wait, I really enjoyed that, and that's what happens. I think we make it comfortable, too comfortable sometimes, and we forget about that, and we do, and we need to really remember that God's blessings are something that we can have every day in this life as Christians, and we need to realize them and relinquish ourselves to God and say, you know, I'm gonna let God take control. And when we do that, things are so much better. And we got to remember, though, some things we'll look at and we go, well, I don't think it's a blessing. We have to look at the will of God and the blessings that are found there in His will, and you'll learn that they are. To just live as a Christian on this earth is a blessing. It is a blessing. Someone may look at it and say, well, it's kind of a curse sometimes to live on this earth. It's not the case at all, because if we're a Christian living on this earth, we know we have the opportunity and example to show others how to get to God, but also we have the opportunity to leave here and find and have an opportunity to do something so much better than what is here, than we're a part of. And this is what Israel's going to learn. Israel was leaving something that was better, something that was great, and they're going to be taken into captivity now, something that's terrible, and we see that happening. And so this is what this book is dealing with, bringing them back and reading about that and seeing. Remember, these are when it's written after, or during that time, but of course they're reading it after and what we see here. So let's go jump to verse 79. Everyone look at Psalm 79. is where we left off with last week as we're looking at 77 through 83. Psalm 79, we realized it's a dangerous situation and a promise, and that happens here. Now, we're not going to read each one of these chapters, of course. We're just going to read a few verses here and then out of them. So if someone wants to go ahead and read Psalm 79, verse 1 and verse 5, that would be great, please. Psalm 79, verse 1 and verse 5.
O God, the heathen are come into thine inheritance. The holy temple have they defiled. They have laid Jerusalem on heaps. How long, Lord, wilt thou be angry forever? Shall thy jealousy burn like fire?
Thank you. So you notice here, they're understanding it now, aren't they? They've figured it out. And they're basically, they know the nations have invaded their inheritance. That's the way they look at it. Their inheritance has been taken. And they want to know, how long is this going to be like this before we come back, before things are restored? So what we learned is that many of the Psalms contain the pleas for God to restore them, for the restoration that will come through God. Psalm 79, verse 8, 80, verse 3, 80, verse 7, 80, verse 19, and just so on in this section here of this taking place, which brings us now to Psalm number 80. Everyone look at Psalm 80. Together, Psalm 79 and 80, they go together. They paint a picture of the whole people of God. And chapter 79 is talking about Judah. Remember, you have the vision of the kingdom, and you have Judah and you have Israel. So we have Judah in 79, and then Israel in the north in chapter 80. Most of the time when we see things happen in Israel, we see one having problems and the other not. One having blessings and the other not. Because where here, they're both being devastated. They're both dealing with what's going on here. And they're in deep trouble, and they're going to have to go through this and deal with what's happening here. So they're looking to God and they say, please restore us. And so this is a very important book that we look to this to understand the perception of what restoration really is. And the perception of what people think restoration is compared to God's restoration. And people are like, I want it to happen how fast? Now, we're experiencing trouble. We've been experiencing for 2 days now. When do we want to be restored? Right away, tomorrow, that day, that evening or not. God said it doesn't work that way. And, I want you to think about the length. I should have done a map. I'll do it later. A map of how far it is from the temple, basically from Jerusalem over to Babylon. They have to basically travel way up and back over and then all the way back down, as we would see. I mean, just think about how long it would take to get there. They're traveling by foot, as you saw in the picture. It's exactly what they would do back then. And I want you to think about how much time they had to think about what they had done wrong. And how much time they had to think about where they were headed. Never being there, not knowing what it's going to look like, but knowing that it is not going to be what they were used to. And as they were walking, they continued to look back and see the smoke getting bigger and bigger and bigger in Jerusalem from the burning of the temple. This is what they experienced. Now, brethren, I guarantee you, for days, maybe weeks, maybe months, there were some of those men there that were of the hierarchy of Israel that I guarantee, as proudful as they were still not looking at God. They weren't thinking, God, get us out. They were thinking, I can't believe you did this to us. That's the way they're looking at it, because that's the way they were acting. And brethren, we need to realize when that happens, the heart has become hard. And it needs to be softened again. I want you to think about everybody that went into captivity, that left Israel, none of those people came back. None of the ones that went into captivity came back. There were all those that were born into captivity, that had been there, that they came back. And we see that in what we read about. And you look at that and you wonder why that's the case, Bill.
God's grace and protection had a limit. The people abused His grace, abused His protection, and they took God for granted. So I wondered when they were on this march, not only were they saying, I can't believe He did this, but they had to be looking at their own innocent children and knowing that they were going to be as punished as the adults were because of the sins and iniquities of the adults. So they fully well saw it. And I was thinking about how God's grace and protection for them, it had a boundary, it had a limit. There was no reciprocity, but you can almost apply that in our relationship with people. We can do and do and do and do and love and love and love and love. And if it's always a one-sided street, there is a limit, there's a boundary to how long we can go there. Now, I'm not saying we ever turn our back either on an unfaithful Christian or someone that's bad to us, but what I am saying is, as time goes by and you see conduct, and it's never reciprocity with the conduct and respect which God was getting, then it reframes your thinking, or it makes you think, I've got to do something here, or I'm going to do something here. I've got to get attention here. Sometimes it's got to be done. So, good point on the wall. I can't believe God did this.
Yeah.
Well, he did.
That's right. And that I can see others thinking that too.
Yes.
You know, the others, you know, and you know, the way those men were prideful, the way they were so prideful, they weren't keeping that to themselves. I guarantee you. They were telling us, look what he's done to us. And I imagine the ones were thinking, look what you did to us.
Yes.
And, you know, and that's what's, and because you think even the women, you know, the women, they weren't, you know, they may not have felt that way, but what were they going to do with the way women were treated back then? I mean, it was totally different.
It's difficult for people to look in the mirror, rather than look in the mirror and say, what did we do? Look what God did.
Yeah.
I mean, look, it's a natural inclination. We want to blame others, not ourselves.
Right.
But looking in the mirror is the first place to go.
That's exactly. You know, when you look at this, those, you know, when people say, well, why didn't others, you know, why did the ones return basically that went? You know, God knew the ones that were leaving where their hearts were. And imagine putting that heart back with the people that hadn't experienced what they'd gone through with the temple. You have these new people coming back, Ezra and everything, and all these others. It's just remarkable as we see this. Doug.
You know, that's the same thing that God did when they came out of Egypt and he made them wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. They didn't have to wander around. He could have led them right into the promised land, but he punished them for what they had done.
Right.
And that's exactly the same thing that he was doing with them going into captivity. But there probably were some that was in that 40 years that had come out of Egypt, and, you know, it may have been a lesson for them. But, you know, I don't think they all died, you know, in that time. But then again, they could have. You know, it could have been the same thing.
Right. When we know some that were on the walk came back, yes, were from Egypt, went into the promised land, like you said. But, you know, what's interesting is you know, I've had people ask me before, why did it take 40 years? That's a long walk. You know, I was like, well, they would have actually been good if everything would have been right. Probably took about a week. I mean, or probably a month or so. I mean, really, when you're walking. And it wasn't that far a place, like you said. They were wandering. They had a lot of time to think about what they had done wrong. And that's what, you know, this is the way God works is until their hearts were right, that's when he allowed them to go into the promised land. And that's what we see happening, you know, being let in there. And even when they got over there, though, some of the problems we saw as were existing too later, they forgot. That's one thing about Israel. Israel, think about how often they went with God, away from God, with God, away from God, with God, away from God. And everyone, you know, I've heard people say, well, that was smart of them. I can't believe they did that. You know, do you think Christians do that all the time too? It happens a lot. It does, and it's sad. And that's where you forget about those blessings. And we need to look at how important those blessings are as we see that happening. So 80 is dealing with this. 79 80 says painting that picture for us, that they're both in trouble. We also understand that 79 verse 5. Everyone look at 79 again. We already read verse 5, but I want us to read 80 verse 4. Someone go and read for us chapter 80 verse 4, please.
O Lord God of hosts, how long wilt thou be angry against the prayers of the people?
Thank you. So, and here's the problem again. Here's what's happening. You notice verse 4, how long will you be angry? Verse 5, how long, O Lord, will you be angry forever? Once again, it comes back with Bill said, who are they blaming here, it sounds like? Like, God, why are you so angry with us? You know, how long are you going to be like this? What do you think God is telling them? Trying to get them to understand. As soon as your hearts turn and you're aware, you really need to be. And you know, all the time people say, okay, God, I'm fine now, I'm okay. God knows our hearts, and he knew their hearts. He knew if they were serious or not. And it came to a point, like Bill was saying earlier, there's a limit. God's long-suffering is amazing and remarkable. But we see that it comes to a point, many, many times, examples in the Bible, where God says, that's enough. But he never, and this is when you need to understand God, he never fully cuts people off. He always allows a remnant. He always allows something to come back. And that's what we see constantly every time with this. So it's important to see that as we go through this. In both cases, God is still the shepherd. We see in chapter 80, verse 1, he's still shepherding them of his people and will still belong to him. He says, we are your people, we are your beloved, and there in verse 1. And then we go on to Psalm 81, Psalm chapter 81. We see here the refusal of God's people to listen to them. I mean, here it is again. Here it is again. You know, they're saying, how long? Then in chapter 81, we read about how they were refusing still to listen to what God had to say. The threat of failing to listen to the Lord, you know, how different things could have been for them. How different things could have been. In fact, God says this. In fact, someone go and look at 81. Let's all look at 81. Someone go and read for us verses 11 through 12, please. 81, 11 through 11, 12. And this is what you would hear, like, coming from God. So someone go and read that, please.
But my people would not hearken to my voice, and Israel would none of me. So I gave them up unto their own heart's lust, and they walked in their own counsels.
Think about that for a moment. So, verse 11 there, my people would not heed my voice, and Israel would have. This is the worst part. Look at that verse. Would not have none of me. I mean, imagine that point. Here it is. They've experienced God's blessings, and then basically with their actions, they're saying, looking to God, saying, I don't want anything to do with you anymore. Just get away from me. And guess what God said? Okay. You walk by your own counsel, that's what you're going to get. And he did that. Let's go a little bit further. Look at verse 13 and 14 now. Someone go and read. But Doug, just go ahead and continue to read there. Verse 13 and 14.
Oh, that my people had hearkened unto me, and Israel had walked in my ways, I should soon have subdued their enemies and turned my hand against their adversaries.
Thank you. Notice what it sounds like here. It sounds like God saying, if your hearts would have turned, because I've heard people say, it didn't matter, they were going to Babylon regardless. Now when we read this verse right here, he said if they would have turned, guess what? He would have subdued their adversaries. In other words, the Babylonians. God would have taken care of it. But he knew they weren't going to do what they needed to do, so they were gone. And they were going to be there. And God, you know, we look at this, we go, we know that God basically tells them, I would always take care of you. He knew they were going to Babylon because they weren't going to change. And we know the prophecies that would show us that came out of Babylon. And how basically strong those Israelites that came out of there became. And how they looked to God. And we see, you know, that they desired to hear the word. Remember when Ezra read those words and the people were just loving to hear what was there in the building of the temple. And remember, they were involved in building, holding their weapons, holding their working tools all at the same time, and just following what God had to say. So these Psalms, what they do here is they help us to uncover not only their sins of Israel, but even our own sins in the 21st century is what these Psalms allow us to do. And show us how people refuse to listen to God, and how people forget Him, His works, His promises, His commands, and they also take us deeper into Himself, into who He is. It allows us to go deeper because when we learn those things and realize those things, sin is something that we want to push as far as we can from us all the time, and we get to do that, which brings us to Psalm 82. Psalm 82 and 83 call on God to judge the whole earth. That's what that is here. It's very simple. 82 and 83, the psalmist is saying, judge the entire earth, not just Israel, everyone. Judge everyone. Well, does God already promise us that? Does He already promise that everybody will be judged one day? Everybody's going to stand before Christ. And we know that in 82, we realize in Psalm 82, we know that Israel appeals to God in the courtroom of heaven to put, there we go, to put the gods of the world on trial. I hit the wrong button. So as we see here, praying for justice, especially for the weak and the defenseless. So here we see is in 82, they're like, judge the whole world, but take care of the weak, take care of the defenseless against Israel and her oppressors. In 82 verse 8, there is an eternal heart of a corrupt legal system they talk about, defending the cause of the weak and the orphans, and there because they really didn't have a voice. They didn't have a voice at all, you know, and they needed the voice. And I think this is remarkable because when we look at these verses here, in fact, everyone look at chapter 82 for just a second. 3 and 4 says, actually I'll start in verse 1. God stands in the congregation of the mighty, He judges among the gods. How long will you judge unjustly and have partiality to the wicked? Defend the poor and the fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and needy. Deliver the poor and the needy. Free them from the hand of the wicked. And so He's telling them, look, these people need a voice. Well, we know when Jesus comes, isn't this exactly who He talks about the church taking care of? And you know that they need to be taken care of. They need this voice. And we see this happening time and time again. So this is important to understand there in chapter 82, which now brings us to Psalm 83, just bumping through these real quick. 83 is a prayer rising out of the world's continual aggression against God and His people. So it's when this happens, when they take them to Babylon, we don't really hear a lot. We know what's going on. We look at Daniel. We look at other areas of what's kind of happening there. But we don't get an idea of the whole world. See, what we learn through the psalm is that it tells us the whole world is beginning to become corrupt again. The entire world. Remember last time what happened when the whole world became corrupt and their thoughts were all corrupt? What did God do? He destroyed all of them except for, he said, if it wasn't for this one righteous man, everybody would be gone. And we see this. And so this again, we know that there was righteousness in some of the people in Israel. Somebody, and this is the way I look at it when I see this, we go, what happened? Some parents had to be teaching their children right, or nobody would have came out of Babylon and came back to Israel. That's what we need to understand. Someone had to have been teaching their children right. They may not have known the whole law of God, because we know Ezra's going to talk about it later, like we said, but they understood the morals of God. They understood what they needed to be doing and who they needed to be following. And we know because we see men like Daniel, we see men like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we see many others there, just how they stood up against the tyrant, of Babylon. Basically, they stood up against the devil and what was found there. And that's what we see. So 83, we understand, is this prayer of, as we said, a rising of the world's continual aggression against God. Ultimately, Jesus Christ. Everyone look at John chapter 10. This is what I said when we come back to Jesus, when we look at this. In John chapter 10, verses 31 through 39, we see that ultimately Jesus will come again as the true judge of the world. And he's going to judge the whole world. I've heard people actually tell me, I've actually had people tell me, well, if I don't believe in Jesus, he can't judge me. And I said, what? They said, well, if I don't believe that he is, I'm not worried about it. When I go from this world, when I die, I'm just going to be asleep. That's it, and nothing will ever come of it. And I'm like, you have a lot to think about here. And that is not the case. And we need to realize every knee will bow before Christ. Every single knee will bow before Christ from the beginning of time to the end. And we realize that. Now, those who are with God, the Bible is very clear about Paul and others. It tells us that they wanted to go to be with Christ, meaning we don't know exactly how that judgment day is going to work, but we know, I always think about this from what I read, is that if we are saved and when we die in this world and we're with God, we're with Christ, and the way the Bible says that our day of judgment, guess what? We'll be wearing Christ. There'll be no judgment against us. We will be there with him because that's how it is. And we see that and how great it is for that blood cleansing us. And so, but we need to realize those who, anybody thinks just because they don't know Jesus or believe in him, that they need to realize they too will, and that's what we're told. John 10. So we'll go and read John 10. We'll start at verse 31. We'll just read to verse 39. John 10, 31 through 39.
Then the Jews took up stones again to stone him. Jesus answered them, "Many good works I have shown you from my Father. For which of those works do you stone me?" The Jews answered him, saying, "For a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, and because you, being a man, make yourself God." Jesus answered them, "Is it not written in your law, I said you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and the scripture cannot be broken, do you say of him whom the Father sanctified and sent into the world, you are blaspheming, because I said, I am the Son of God? If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me. But if I do, though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and believe that the Father is in me, and I in him." Therefore they sought again to seize him, but he escaped out of their hand.
Thank you. It shows us that Jesus is exactly who he said he was, Son of God, God on earth. He has the ability to we understand, to judge everybody. And he said, basically said this verse, whether you believe me or not, it's going to happen. Whether you believe me or not, I am whom I said I am. And this is what I want to get at here, and we need to realize that, because we see in Psalm 83 that that's kind of what it's getting at, that it's like, well, if people don't look to God, they don't believe in God, they don't have to worry about him, they just worry about their gods. No. That's where Jesus said, your gods are nothing to God. They're just made up. And that's what we find there. So together with Psalm 87, basically we understand, actually let's go on, 84, 87. Together with 87, when we jump forward a little bit, we can see the universal aspect of the Psalms. God has a saving purpose for the whole earth, but there will also be a worldwide judgment upon sin. This is the part we need to teach people. It's not just that everybody be judged for their sin, but everybody has a way to salvation. The entire world has a way to salvation, and it comes through Christ. So in Psalm 84, 87, there's a major change of a largely positive perspective. Isn't that great to see things are like, okay, we figured it out. Those of us who have been in Babylon, we're getting things right. We're knowing what's happened. The Medes and the Persians have taken them over now. And it's like, all right, well, we're figuring this out. Psalm 84 basically tells us that the psalmist longs for God's house, to be worshiping in God's dwelling place on earth. In other words, they have figured it out now that we want to go back to Jerusalem and we want to build God's house again. We want to be a part of this. And so, because why was God's house so important to the Jews? Where did God say he would reside with the people? In his temple. And we know that hadn't happened in a long time because of the way they were acting. But what did the people really not get to do per the instructions of God without the temple, without the tabernacle? The tabernacle within the temple, they didn't rebuild the tabernacle or anything like that. What did they not get to do? They didn't get to worship properly. And you know, that's, imagine if it came, you know, I want you to just think about this for a moment. Go back to the beginning of COVID when it got really bad and everything, and churches had to shut down everywhere. I mean, and you know, a week or two, it's like one thing, but then you start going months. And you know, and you start, it's like, wait a minute, this isn't right. I want you to think back to these people in Babylon. You know, it's like, we need to worship. We want to worship God. And it's not that this building, but it's coming together. There, yes, it was the temple that they had to do this. But that's what we see. And we know, you know, a lot of people probably looked at later and go, I just took that so much for granted. Didn't realize how important that was and what I'm missing. And, you know, some areas, you know, congregations went over a year. You know, it went 18, 19 months before we came back together. I mean, as a whole, and it's happening again in some congregations again throughout the country, and we see this in not just the country, but throughout the world. So I want us to really think about that, how these people feel now. They're like, yes, this is finally there. Verse 1, look at verse 1 of chapter 84. Turn back over to Psalm 84, and we're going to start there. 6 minutes. All right. Psalm 84, and I want you to look here. Someone go ahead and read first, verse 1 and verse 10. 84, verse 1 and verse 10.
How amiable are thy tabernacles, O Lord of hosts! For a day in thy courts is better than 1,000. I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness.
I mean, think about that. I mean, that says it all, doesn't it? I mean, not even have any kind of high position, just a doorkeeper. I mean, I hold the door for everybody to come in or close it when it's over, you know. I mean, that's what I'll do. They were seeing what they wanted to have again and what they could be a part of. See, brethren, God desires, or he desires, we see the one writing this, to be with those at the temple, the birds, the priests, the pilgrims. Although this may be him imaging, you know, imagining the temple basically, you know, not being destroyed and thinking about how it used to be and what it was. We understand that we feel like, you know, as I said, we felt that same way probably with the pandemic, the way things were going and what was found there. Yet he ends in verse 12 by acknowledging something this. This is what we need to see here. We'll look at verse 12. That the truly blessed person is not determined by location or worship site, but rather by trusting the Lord. This is what's remarkable here. They were figuring out in Israel, you know, it was going to come to a time where it didn't matter where you met, you know, to worship, but they were figuring out, they're like, wait a minute. Why can't we worship God without the temple right now? We know we can do everything, but why can't we pray to him, look to him, and think about him? Look what verse 12 says. They're starting to figure things out, and it says, O Lord of hosts, bless the man who trusts in you. And we see throughout that chapter that brings it out, that they are trusting him and looking at him. And, you know, John, we just read it, John 20, verse 29. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. You think about those people that were there and that were born there in captivity, never really experienced God at all. But they still believed in who he was and what he was about. And you and I can have the same thing. See, brethren, the application here is, do you and I long to be with our other brethren and worship our God? Is that what we look to? Do we long for being with God in heaven one day? And I pray that we do. Because I've said this before. If people, you know, don't enjoy coming to worship, but they still want to say, I'm part of the church, but they don't want to come to worship, do you really think you want to be in heaven? Because that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be with one another, and they're like, oh yeah, I want to be in heaven. But why would you not want to be the closest thing you get to heaven here on earth? Be with it. And that's what we see in the church. So chapter 85, as we finish up through these, 85 is praying for people to recognize once again the importance of the Lord. Then we need to remember the past, when God turned from his anger against his sinful people and restored the fortress of Jacob. We're going to talk about that. We'll see in these chapters, verses 1 through 3. And asking God to do that again, now in the present, for his people in exile. Verses 4 through 7, they're starting to figure this out. A plea to God to restore us, to revive us, followed by a pause for meditation. So they're like, restore us, restore us, restore us. We need to take a moment and thank God. We need to think about this for a moment. And then prayers for future vision of God's blessings of love, faithfulness, and righteousness in verses 10 through 12. Which brings us then to verse 8, chapter 86. Chapter 86. This is, 86 is the only Davidic psalm. So from David, in book 3. It's the only one. In the entire 73 through chapter 89, it's the only one of David. And it's a prayer from David. And in this prayer, David is talking about needing, being very needy, and ask God for deliverance and mercy. And you know, you wonder about this. When we talk about the way these books have been placed, chapters have been placed in these books, we wonder, this is a perfect time to place this psalm to David, because this is what the people need to hear. That even David felt poor and needy and needed deliverance, just like they do. And when they thought of David, they thought David was the man after God's own heart, the closest man to God's heart. And we see this here, so it helped them. So he appeals to God's character, declares Lord's sovereignty over the gods and the nations. David asked God for wisdom, mercy, protection from his enemies. And when the people would read this later, they would say, this is exactly what we need to do. And through this personal psalm, it just fits so well with the theme of Israel being devastated by the nations at this time, which brings us now to chapter 87. I guess I have that up there, 87. And we're going to go ahead and read 87. 87 is only 7 verses. And I want you to see what happens here. It's basically 87 is about God's grace that brings in undeserving outsiders, even people from oppressive enemy nations, and blesses them with the privilege of citizenship in God's blessed kingdom. So we see things turning and moving in that direction. It says this. It says, his foundations is in the holy mountains. The Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. Glorious things are spoken of you, a city of God. I will make mention of Rahab and Babylon to those who know me. Behold, of Philistia and Tyre and Ethiopia, this one was born there. And of Zion it will be said, this one and that one were born here in her. And the Most High himself shall establish her. The Lord will record when he registers the peoples, this one was born there. See, what we need to understand when we read this here is, here's Babylon. Babylon took Israel. Do you think it was only Israel they took? We don't think about it like that, do we? We think about usually like, oh, they only took it. Think about what Nebuchadnezzar was doing. He was trying to conquer the what? The world. There were more people there than just Israel. And we see these things happening and realizing this and the importance with this of what's taking place here. So, when you're in captivity, you start turning to different people that you don't even know, of course, and because you're all dealing with the same thing and the restoration that need to be found. So here's these foreign Gentiles. They will be able to say they were native-born citizens of Zion, is what he's getting at here. This is a picture of the New Testament gospel also. So you have this interchange here of blessings where all nations will come and worship the Lord and trust in him that we can all be a part of. Psalm 87 also, God's words go beyond faith of the Jews to believe that God will cause oppressive enemy Gentiles to embrace the gospel message. So what he's showing here is what happens here will actually cause people later down the road to know what happened to them during that time. And when Jesus comes on the scene, they're like, wait a minute, this is the Son of God, the same God that helped everybody out of Babylon. And what we see going forth and the importance with it, which brings us to 88 and 89, and I'm out of time. All right, so 88 and 89, there's no way I'm going to finish that before. And I thought I could finish it in 1 minute. Can't do it. So we're going to go stop there. Any comments or questions? You see there's a lot in this book 3 that's real important. Bill?
Well, God's people were being told what to do, loss of freedom, and dictated to on their conduct and actions by ungodly people. And that was, is there any worse punishment than having that? And they knew it.
Yeah.
And couldn't do anything about it.
And that's the words right there. They could not do anything about it. Because the decision had already made by God, you're going to stay here for a while. Because once they got there, that was it. And they couldn't control who was in control of them. And remember, they went through 2 empires, not just Babylon's, then the Medo-Persians. And things got a little better under them, but it was still continuing. because of their lack in faith. But it was so great to see in this book, we see that that faith would return, and how great that is. All right, any comments or questions? Any others? All right, appreciate it. Thanks.